On today's episode of the Going Commando podcast, we have an emergency podcast for the people. It is discussing our recent coaching hires, of course, most notably head coach Dan Quinn and the additions of defensive coordinator Joe Whitt Jr. and offensive coordinator Kliff Kingsbury. So we're going to break down all of the changes in the coaching staff. So stick around, stay tuned, and let's get this show on the road. Welcome to Going Commando, a Washington Commanders podcast.
Hello and welcome, Going Commando fans, to an emergency episode of the podcast today. As some of you may know, as most of us know by this point, we've had a series of coaching changes that have happened within the Washington Commanders building. An entirely new staff by the looks of it. A lot of exciting names, a lot of cool faces to see in the building. And there's a lot to react to. So let's just start off with the big fish of the day. We have Dan Quinn coming over from the Dallas Cowboys. Former head coach of the Atlanta Falcons, was also with the Seahawks for a short period of time. A guy who really knows how to win and get to the the highest levels of this game. So I'm just curious, guys, how do you see this hiring panning out as we look towards the future?
Yeah, thanks, Tom, and happy to be here. And this is some good things to talk about. I know we briefly discussed as part of the last episode some of our thoughts around, the coaching vacancy and who we thought that was going to go to. And I think overall, at first, at the first notice of hey, Dan Quinn's the guy, I think a lot of us were taken aback or maybe a little surprised at that. The more as we progress through this, the more that comes to light, the more it's making sense, and we'll be able to get a little bit more into that as to why I think that. But um, I think my knee-jerk reaction was a little bit of disappointment because we were kind of sold this narrative around, hey, we're getting one of these young offensive-minded guys in this league, like a Ben Johnson or a Bobby Slowick, or a guy kind of on that level, something that a lot of other teams in this league have been doing and seem to had some success with in doing, is finding one of these younger offensive minded head coaches. So I think a lot of people, myself included, were, a little bit shocked and taken aback by, not only those guys dropping out of their respective kind of, um, candidacy positions, but also how quickly we transitioned over to Dan Quinn as the guy, right after that those other, guys kind of dropping out came to light. So I think there's a lot to unpack there. But overall, as I've looked at this a little bit more over the last week and days, I'm more and more a fan of it. I think you kind of take a look at, hey, if you can't have one of these guys that we were kind of slated by the media and everyone else to take, right? What do you do next? You kind of look at who's on the market, look at, what the ownership group wants to do. I think that, hey, if we didn't get, and this is just all speculative, of course, but hey, if we weren't able to get, one of our guys, this Slowick or Johnson that we were kind of really eyeing, do we have a backup plan in place? And if so, like what is that kind of candidate we look for? And I think they wanted someone with some direct experience in this league, someone that, they know is still relevant to players and that has had success in multiple places that he's been and not just necessarily one, and has a track record of success. So I like the hire. I definitely have a lot more to say on it. But overall, I'm excited to see. Obviously, don't think it's a done deal or a surefire hit by any means either. So, what were your thoughts, Clark? When you kind of got this news?
Yeah, my thoughts were they're definitely negative upon first seeing this news. And
Right.
I think part of that just kind of plays into the whole fact that this guy was the Cowboys coordinator. and that whole added element to it just makes, as fans, we want to have these, knee-jerk reactions when we see, you know, Mike McCarthy or whoever it might be from the Cowboys organization, Dan Quinn, there's just an inherent kind of inherent distaste for those within that organization. And I think upon first seeing this, you know, you're like, oh wow, Dan Quinn, Dallas Cowboys, they just got bounced in the playoffs. It wasn't a good look for his defense. What are they going to do with him this season? Will they roll it back with him? Will he get a job somewhere? And so my first initial reaction was kind of not very happy. I was sitting in my office. My boss, who's a Giants fan, broke the news to me, and it wasn't great in that moment. Um, but again, taking some more time and thinking about this more logically, there are reasons to be excited, and there are reasons why this could be a good hire. Again, you mentioned his experience, whether that's in all facets of football. He's done it at the very lowest level, or not the lowest level, but he's done it in collegiate football as a defensive coordinator, defensive line coach, and worked his way up over a number of years. Again, also something to add, Salisbury University graduate, so he does have
Oh,
some
Seagulls.
ties. Yeah, he does have some ties to the area. Um, but I do think that from what I've heard around the league and seen online is that Uh, this is a guy that players tend to like playing for. He's relatable, and he's also, you know, not that old. I want to say he's maybe 50, 52 or something. So it's not like we're hiring a Belichick or someone or like a Pete Carroll or someone like that who really, doesn't have time left to undergo a full rebuild. And that's what we need in this coach because we know that it's not going to be overnight.
Yeah, and that's a great point, Clark. I do respect sort of the points you hit on at first with the Cowboys. I mean, there is obviously some sour taste in our mouth that we took the Cowboys coordinator, and you make a great point. They did just get bounced recently in the playoffs with a very talented team that honestly should have gotten much further than it did. Um, but Dan Quinn is a guy who I was actually happy that we got. He's got somewhat of a pedigree to him. He's been a coach around the league. He obviously won a Super Bowl with the Seahawks during their Legion of Boom days as the defensive coordinator. He was at Florida as a defensive coordinator during the Tebow years. Um, he was the head coach of the Falcons when they got to the Super Bowl. He's been on the Cowboys the past few years. So he's got a pedigree at the very least, which is something that you got to kind of be happy about, is that you get a guy who at least is proven to be a guy who knows the game and who has a lot of experience. Um, that being said, he is a guy who all we've seen from him in the past few years is disappointing playoff exits. And we haven't seen the Commanders make the playoffs since 2019, so obviously um that's a bit of a hope of ours, I guess, to be in the playoffs at all. Um but anyways, sorry. Moving on from that, Twine. The one thing that I did really want to point out about Dan Quinn is that the Commanders posted a quote from Dan Quinn's introductory press conference, which I believe was either today or yesterday, where he said, "There's nothing more I enjoy doing uh, than hard shit with good people." So he clearly believes in the organization. He likes the people around him, and he's willing to commit to this thing and really put some elbow grease into it. And coming off of a guy like Ron Rivera, who seemed to micromanage his way around being a head coach for the Commanders for the past few years, it gives me a lot of hope that hopefully this guy's going to be talking on the sidelines. Hopefully this guy's going to be doing the right things as a head coach to get us to where we want to be and really sort of, hopefully this guy brings over the winning sort of culture that some of these teams he's been on has had at times. And who knows, maybe we see him taking us to the playoffs for the first time in a long time. So I have obviously a lot of optimism towards this hiring. I think it's a really good hire. Clark, you make a great point with the ties to home as a Salisbury University graduate. And he seems like he's really committed to this team as a whole. And I think that's, a series of qualities from a head coach that you can't, pass up on when you're doing these hiring processes and looking for the best candidate for your team and trying to fit everything together. So I think he's an amazing coach for this team to have. And he's certainly an asset for ownership to have. But yeah, hopefully this guy, doesn't have a similar sort of Rivera-esque year as the head coach of the Commanders, who we formerly had in Ron Rivera.
Well, yeah, I kind of wanted to ask you guys about that because when you look across the board, there are several similarities between Quinn and Rivera. Well, namely, of course, that he's a defensive coach coming off of a quote unquote defensive minded guy in Rivera. Say what you will about how that went down, but Quinn has a lot of similarities. So obviously, has been a defensive coordinator, much like Rivera was. He was the head coach of an NFC South team that had an MVP quarterback that went to the Super Bowl and lost. Now, all that's all very coincidental, but I don't think it's necessarily wrong to compare them. They were two guys that had success as a head coach in a spot, and then things kind of got ugly towards the end. The difference here is that Quinn was able to take a step back, re-solidify his standing amongst NFL executives and people around the league as a respected coach doing what he did in Dallas, whereas Rivera kind of went straight from one head coaching position to the next. So I think that is definitely a good sign. But however, I do think there's a lot of similarities between these two guys, and kind of in a nutshell, I think you can compare them somewhat. Um, do you guys think that that is an issue or something to be, worried about going forward? Is that we've gone from a defensive coach to another defensive coach right after?
Yeah, I don't think that's too much of an issue. Honestly, I think it's comparing apples to oranges in some way. Uh, Dan Quinn is a guy who he certainly took his licks as the Atlanta Falcons head coach, and there's certainly a lot of comparisons which you can draw to him and Rivera. But ultimately, Dan Quinn went to the Cowboys and took a lesser position and sort of sat back and learned a little bit and sort of re-solidified, as you said. Um, but he came out of it looking stronger, whereas I think Rivera goes to the Commanders and instead of trying to build something there, he kind of coasted off what he had in Carolina. And maybe ownership has something to do with that a bit more than the past. And I think that's maybe one of the biggest differences between Quinn and Rivera is that Quinn's going to have a different ownership group that will potentially make bigger moves, be a bit splashier, um, possibly even sort of take more risk and sort of get these guys who are difference makers rather than having players like William Jackson the third and Landon Collins be sort of our splashier guys. We'll get someone that has real pedigree behind them. So I think that there's definitely a fairness in the comparison that you make there, but I don't necessarily think it's correct.
Yeah, I am curious to see what his approach will be in the free agency side of things. But I think you're right, Clark, in that their profile of them, Rivera and Dan Quinn is very similar, being on the older side, defensive minded coaches that have, both had direct head coach experience, both been to Super Bowls, both lost Super Bowls. However, I think the coaching style, and I certainly hope so, is going to be different than what we saw at Rivera. I think you're seeing a guy who's got more energy. He's going to be more vocal. Players seem like they can rally around him maybe a little bit easier than they could Rivera. I believe Dan Quinn to be more in touch with today's game than and I would hope than we saw from Rivera. I think Dan Quinn, he's kind of at that middle ground, right? He's not one of these super young guys that's gonna, you know, really, turn everything around on its head for better, for worse, but he's also not, a Belichick or a Pete Carroll who's, really in the tail end of their career and very much so stuck in their ways and maybe not willing to adapt as much to today's game. So I think you look, I think what they did is this Harris group, and again, we can speak to more of this too when we get to talking about some of their personnel decisions. But I think the Harris group, maybe they did in fact want one of the kind of the two leading offensive minded young guy candidates. And the second those were off the market, or maybe even before then, they took a hard look and said, okay, who realistically is left? Who's a guy that we can trust to bring into this league that kind of fits our mold, isn't on the older side. We don't really want a Rivera repeat. And are we comfortable with a defensive minded guy? Obviously they were. I think you kind of look, hey, guys that kind of fit the mold in that range. I am surprised that a guy like Mike Vrabel didn't get a harder look from our organization. Maybe there's something that they know that we don't. But I think you kind of looked at who was left. I know the Mike people talked about Mike McDonald. Obviously, he's with the Seahawks now. But the pickings became kind of slim fairly quickly, I believe, and based on what was left after, the no-go news on Slowick and Johnson, I think that Dan Quinn very quickly became one of the top candidates available really on the market. And so for that reason, I am, again, as I mentioned, overall, I'm okay with this. I still, really need to see it in action before I'm fully gung ho and behind it, of course. Um, but yeah, I do see some parallels absolutely between Dan Quinn and Rivera, and I hope that we don't see any sort of similarities between Rivera's time in Washington and what we see from Dan Quinn.
Yeah, and moving on from this topic slightly, one of the things that we will see from Dan Quinn in this regime is sort of his style of defensive coaching. And that's something which, has brought success in the past with the Cowboys. Obviously, the caveat there being that they've had some very talented players in their defense. Um, but we'll see them bring over this coaching style, which has worked well for the Cowboys and kind of gotten them into these positions where, they are in the playoffs and they're secure and they can kind of breathe a little bit with knowing that their defense can make some moves. And one of the people who we first kind of assumed, but it was officially brought over, I believe, in the past few days, was Joe Whitt Jr., the defensive coordinator for the Commanders now. I believe he was an assistant of some sort for the Cowboys, or maybe a special advisor of some sort.
He was the secondary coach and pass game coordinator uh, since 2021 for Dallas.
Yes, so he filled
Defensive pass game coordinator.
Yes, secondary coach and passing
Right.
game on the defensive side.
Yes, and he was very integral to sort of this Dallas secondary, which you saw Duran Bland, set the season record for season pick sixes this year, having his record breaker against the Commanders, obviously a moment that sadly none of us will forget. But when you see a guy like Joe Whitt Jr. come through the office, and take over this defense, and you see the fact that Quinn's defensive philosophy will kind of be solidified within this team. What are your takes on that? Do you think it's positive, negative? What do you guys think?
I I think there's a lot to like about this guy. He's only 45, so he's not necessarily um, another older kind of guy brought in like a Del Rio as like we saw our past regime bringing in as the defensive coordinator. And this is a guy who's been coaching in the NFL since 2007 in various roles. But this will be his first ever opportunity as a defensive coordinator. He was with Dallas from 21 to 23. Looks like in 2020, which I believe was Quinn's last year with Atlanta, he was the same position, secondary coach and passing game coordinator. So this is a guy that Quinn clearly has connections to from before Dallas. And worked with his entire time in Dallas. And you mentioned Deron Bland, but let's also not forget in that same kind of time span, it was when we saw Trayvon Diggs elevate his game, become an elite corner, just a takeover machine. And so Dallas's defense, with the help of a guy like, you know, Joe Whitt Jr. directly working with those guys in the secondary was able to turn Dallas's defense into one of the top, scoring defenses and top turnover defenses in the league. Um, and I can attest to that as well, having owned the Dallas defense in fantasy. I know that might be sacrilegious, but it definitely helped me over the past couple of years. But nonetheless, I would say, again, it's not exactly a flashy name, but I think that this could be a good hire for us. And it'll be his first ever opportunity, truly, being a defensive coordinator. We'll see if Quinn, how he alleviates the calling of defensive plays, whether he's going to, give full trust in Joe Whitt, or will he continue to kind of oversee that a little bit. Regardless, I have no issue with the sire.
Yeah, we'll pretend we didn't hear anything that you just said about Dallas being on your fantasy rosters as the defense the past few years. But, anyways, I think Dan Quinn. Look, I think Dan Quinn, and Tom mentioned his comment earlier in the press conference. I think he understands this isn't going to be a cakewalk. Look, like I think he realizes this is a franchise that has struggled for many years, and that it's not going to be a quick turnaround necessarily. Now, we all would like there to be improvement, and I think based off a season like we just had, you will see immediate improvement. Just because I already think that we're putting guys in place and a staff in place that is better than what we had previously. And I think he, knowing that this is going to be a cakewalk, Dan Quinn wants to equip himself. To the best ability that he can to be successful here. And I think that's bringing a guy like Joe Whitt, a guy that he is familiar with, a guy that he's grown in his own career with, and that he trusts. I've also heard that Joe Whitt is a little bit of a hard ass in terms of just how he goes about his business, how he conducts practice, and how he really operates his area of kind of control within the team. And so I'm actually excited for that. I think it's something that we could use a lot of. And then and I think you alluded to this, Clark, as well. I also like the fact that he's not necessarily an already well-established defensive coordinator or previous head coach in this league. Previously we had Rivera, you bring in Del Rio, both head coaches, both defensive-minded previous head coaches. Maybe their philosophies were similar, but there's obviously going to be differences there. This, bringing in a guy that is really kind of grown under the wing of Dan Quinn, who's obviously a defensive guy himself, really doesn't, there's not going to be hopefully any room for, the butting of heads on philosophy or, miscommunications on what type of scheming they want to put in place. Now, I think they're going to be much more lockstep on the same page. And there's going to be less of this blame game that seemed to go around, oh, the defense is wrong. Oh, we're going to blame Jack for that, or, Jack said this, or I'm letting Jack run. No, I mean, I think Dan is going to have a large involvement with this, and they're going to be lockstep along with Joe. And I think you're going to see hopefully a lot of the success that you've seen out of that pairing, like you have in Dallas and perhaps even earlier. So I think Dan Quinn, knows what he's getting into. He doesn't seem like a dumb guy to me. Maybe a little bit more quick-witted than Rivera. Again, don't want to speak too ill of Rivera because I respect what he's been able to do in this league so far, but it was time for him to go. And I think I can already tell the decisions that Dan Quinn is making around personnel seem to already be better than those that Rivera was ever making.
Yeah, and I think that's really a big part of this is that, for the first time in what seems like years, honestly, there seems to be a vision towards how they want to build this team. And it looks to be through hard work and grit. And I think those are two things that we've really needed over the past few years. Um, Not speaking ill of the roster, of course, but rather the coaching staff. I feel like we've certainly been let down by a number of guys in the past uh, who haven't necessarily, maybe not necessarily been committed to the team, but more who have had an issue connecting with the team and have butted heads with the head coach in the past. Um, I definitely love the hiring of Joe Whitt. Like you guys, I think that he's a guy who's definitely going to maintain the locker room with Quinn very well. Um, I think that it's also interesting to think that this will be the first time in his entire career, I believe, where he will be the defensive coordinator of any program, much less an NFL team. Um, so it'll be curious to see how that all works out. But obviously, there's one last guy who we have to talk about, and I think this is maybe the most interesting hire of the entire Commanders offseason, and a guy who I certainly um, had sort of a negative reaction to upon first hearing this, but we saw a guy like Eric Bieniemy last year who ran an offense that, while adventurous and certainly very prototypical of the new NFL with the amount of passing it had. Uh, the Eric Bieniemy offense that we saw with the Commanders last year just simply did not work. So and he has been released of all of his duties. They will not be keeping him on at all. And the new offensive coordinator for this Commanders team will be Kliff Kingsbury, a man who last time we saw him was the head coach of the Arizona Cardinals. He had made some very interesting comments after his firing about wanting to go to Thailand. And he has apparently come back and decided that the Washington Commanders are to be his new offensive project with his air raid offense. So I'm curious, what do you guys think about Kliff Kingsbury, a guy who hasn't necessarily been around the league per se in the past few years, and but was a guy who certainly feels like an interesting hire, if nothing else, and certainly a talking point for this Commander's future.
So we did just finish up talking about how we were excited, and it's refreshing to see that our defensive coordinator we hired isn't necessarily a head coaching retread. And now on the flip side, of course, Kingsbury, although they did have a year where they made the playoffs, overall was not really a success as a head coach in the NFL. Um, of course, coming from Texas Tech, where he worked with a guy like Patrick Mahomes. Um, you know, so this is a guy that has a lot of experience in offensive football, and of course, he was the offensive coordinator at USC prior to taking this job. And I think that for that fact alone, um, I think that is really the biggest storyline going forward, considering who he was coaching at USC and what USC quarterback happens to be entering the NFL draft this upcoming season in a draft where we have the number 2 overall pick. I'm of course alluding to Caleb Williams. The connections were already being made there as well, given that he's a guy that's from DC. But I think with this hire, um, if anything, it's showing our cards. I think that I wouldn't be shocked if kind of the plan might be to try to target him in the draft, especially now that you've hired a coach that he's familiar with. So that was kind of my first gut reaction. I wasn't necessarily upset with it. I think Kingsbury as a coordinator, I think there's a lot more potential there than him being a head coach. We saw, maybe perhaps wasn't the most successful being a head coach, but without having to manage the entire team and, really being able to focus on offense and maybe get the opportunity to develop a young player. I thought that there's some potential with this hire, but of course, I think again this hire kind of brings a lot of attention, and you're going to be hearing stories about Caleb Williams to DC for the next several months.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely was hearing a lot of obviously the Caleb Williams talk. I really didn't quite know how to feel about this hire when I first saw it. Um, I'm more okay with a former head coach on the offensive side of this team, given that our head coach is a defensive minded guy. So I am a little bit more okay with that. And I think regardless of the Caleb Williams talk, Kliff Kingsbury is known for developing young QBs and working with younger quarterbacks that are, coming out of the draft that get these more modern style offenses and things of that nature. So I do think that, look, it all signs to us taking a quarterback of some sort this year. I think that he ultimately will be very helpful in the development of that QB. That's wishful thinking, but I think that I understand that perspective of it. And then if you think about it from Kliff Kingsbury's perspective, this is a guy that has a lot to play for. Similar to Dan Quinn, this is a guy that was a former head coach, perhaps had a slight fall from grace from that head coaching job, and is now trying to reestablish himself in this league to position himself for another head coaching job in the future. He's a very young guy. I guarantee you, Kliff Kingsbury isn't content with just being an offensive coordinator the rest of his career. He wants another crack at a head coaching job. And how does he do that? By reestablishing himself in this league, by having a good year or two with a team like the Washington Commanders and turning things around for them. So I think he's got a lot on the table, and at stake for his own personal reasons in career, which I think bodes well for us because he, you know, unlike maybe some other coaches in other positions, across the league, or in previous years, his career is on the line. It's kind of similar to Bieniemy, right? Who didn't do a good job of it, right? He finally got the opportunity to prove himself outside of the Andy Reid sphere, and he didn't. He did a poor job of it. So now, hey, will Bieniemy ever even get a crack at an OC job again? Who knows? It's certainly not a head coaching candidate, at this point. Or at least not at this time. He's got to build himself back up to that. But, I think Kliff Kingsbury's got a lot that he wants to prove and put on tape, for this league and for the future of his career. So I am excited about him for that regard because I think he's hungry. And one more point I wanted to make surrounding Kliff Kingsbury is you notice how quickly that hire was made after we got the news about Dan Quinn becoming the head coach. Very quickly. I mean, I was a couple days, if that, right? So you know what that tells me? That tells me that this was all decided well before we even got any inclination as to what was going on. This tells me that the Harris Group, whether or not Dan Quinn was their first choice or not, whether or not they really did want this Ben Johnson guy or the Slowick guy, it tells me that they had identified Dan Quinn as their basically guy, plan B guy, plan A potentially, but at the very least, plan B guy. The second they knew things weren't going to happen with Johnson or Slowick, they locked in Quinn. They probably told him he had the job. They probably, well in advance of anything, even putting pen to paper, because a guy like Dan Quinn, a guy that's coming into a head coaching job, if you're given the reins and autonomy to build out your staff, you want to start doing that ASAP. So I guarantee you that Kingsbury knew he was being brought in, as well as Joe Whitt, well before perhaps even the announcement of Dan Quinn being the head coach was made. So for that even further gives me more confidence in this group because it tells me that the Harris Group had identified these guys along with Adam Peters and felt good about them enough to the point where they were making these calls before making them public to allow these guys time to go scramble around and figure out, really allow Dan, time to go around, figure out who are my main guys on my staff going to be. So overall, the way this played out, the more it played out, the more I could kind of see, okay, what is this front office really doing here? What was maybe going on behind the scenes that we weren't privy to and now is maybe coming to light more. So, for those reasons, I am excited about the Kingsbury hire as well as, Whitt and Quinn being hired. And I do think a lot of this was perhaps decided and not as kind of reactionary as the media or us as fans are perceiving it to be.
So Kliff Kingsbury, let me correct myself. Kliff Kingsbury was not the offensive coordinator. He was a senior offensive analyst. But in other words, they brought him in just for this season to probably work exclusively with Caleb Williams. And you alluded to the fact that they might have had this planned out already in motion before the announcement of Quinn was hired. Do you think that, identifying Kingsbury as a guy they wanted to bring in, do you think that that has anything to do with what they plan on doing in the draft?
I think it's possible. And I think obviously there's going to be speculation there. On a personal note, am I 100% sold on Caleb Williams over, a guy like Jaden Daniels or Drake May? I don't think so. Um, however, I could be wrong, and I obviously that part's out of our control. Do I think that Kingsbury was necessarily brought in just because we were dead set on going after Williams? I don't think so. I could very well be wrong. However, unless Adam Peters is absolutely head over heels for Caleb Williams and that's his guy, I don't know if that was necessarily the sole factor or deciding factor in bringing on Kingsbury. I think kind of like you said before, kind of like I was saying before. Kingsbury is a guy who's done it at a high level in this league, who has a proven record of working well with young quarterbacks. The fact that he worked with potentially the number one overall pick this most recent last season. Now, yeah, obviously there's comparisons and things that you're gonna tie him into there. So yeah, I do think it's very possible that had was a factor in it. But then you also have to think about it. Look, the Bears are also a franchise that have had struggles with finding a franchise quarterback for many years. Do they really have that in Justin Fields right now? Maybe, probably not. Are they willing to give up their position they found themselves in? I think a lot of that comes down to their evaluation of Caleb Williams too. Are they head over heels for him, or is there another guy in this draft that they like? Do they think that we're willing to mortgage our future and a lot of our capital to go up one spot to get him? If they think that we're willing to do that, or maybe dumb enough in a lot of perspective eyes to do that, why not take advantage of us doing that and reap the benefits of that, and even if they're not completely sold on Caleb Williams being their guy, right? So I don't know. I definitely can't make that assumption. I definitely think, obviously, that, like you said, there's going to be some assumptions tied to that hire relating to that.
Yeah, and I don't think it's fair to necessarily say that we hired Kliff Kingsbury just because of Caleb Williams. I think you look back, he made a Cardinals team that was not all that impressive, get to an 11-6 record in the NFC West in 2022. Or maybe that was 2021, but still, you understand the message. He made them relevant, and he made them get to the playoffs, and certainly his offense had something to do with that. But I think Kliff Kingsbury was brought in because he's one of probably the more exciting young offensive minds in all of football right now, and he's a guy that kind of is a relative free agent after sort of leaving the Cardinals, and as you mentioned, Clark, doing that sort of weird stint at USC where they didn't really give him a specified role besides being an offensive analyst or assistant um, at USC. So I definitely don't think that this is just for Caleb Williams, although I understand the people that are hypothesizing that. Now, we would have to probably be in the number one overall pick position to get Caleb Williams because regardless of what we may think of him, I think a lot of uh, NFL teams and sort of higher ups in those organizations really, want the guy, especially the Bears, who could potentially move on from a guy like Justin Fields for Caleb Williams, and really the question becomes, what is the value of Justin Fields' capital in that scenario, so that you're not taking that big of a loss on him. All that being said, though, I don't think I mean, I really don't want to believe that we hired Kliff Kingsbury for Caleb Williams. I think that this was a much more nuanced hire. I mean, obviously, him working with Caleb Williams helped that sort of narrative, but it also helped Kliff Kingsbury sort of regain his relevance, and I think that's part of why you see him at the Commanders this year is because of what he did with Caleb Williams, not what he will do with Caleb Williams in the NFL. Um, I would like to kind of just remind you guys. I mean, OC is a position that we've had a lot of issues with in the past. We have had issues with guys like Eric Bieniemy last year, as an example, who kind of ran this absurdist sort of prototypical offense of the modern NFL, and then you have guys like Scott Turner, who I know that we were all frustrated with the play calling of in the past. Um, Now, do I think that we get better play calling with Kliff Kingsbury? I don't know. I feel like he really does seem to be a guy that likes to throw it a lot, and that seemed to be what Bieniemy's uh modus operandi was when he was the offensive coordinator with the Commanders. So I'm not sure what changes. I definitely do think that this secures the idea that we'll probably be moving on from Sam Howell with this second overall pick. I mean, the opportunity to draft a guy sort of like a Drake May or like a Jaden Daniels or even a Caleb Williams if we get so lucky does not come up too often. And Chris, I'd like to reiterate what you said earlier, where I don't think mortgaging our future on Caleb Williams by giving away all these draft picks to the Bears or giving up what would be probably substantial capital for the number one overall pick is really the move for us. I feel like we've seen this happen before with a guy like RG3, and that set us back how many years? None of us can really tell. Arguably, it may have even set us back until now. Um, but I think that this Kliff Kingsbury hire is ultimately very positive after giving it some consideration, and that I think that Kliff Kingsbury is a guy who uh, if nothing else, adds an interesting dimension to this Washington Commanders team that's somewhat of an unknown right now, especially with all the contracts and things that can happen with the draft.
Yeah, and let's also keep in mind, it's not a done deal that Kingsbury comes in here and we even go with a fresh rookie quarterback. Now I do think all signs do point to that happening and us taking a quarterback in the first round. But you got to keep in mind, he's coming from one of these more modern, air raid style offenses, actually very similar to what a guy like Sam Howell did in college as well. So I'm not saying the door is completely shut on Hal. I do. Part of me thinks that he will be part of this team moving forward. Maybe not in that starting role. I have a soft spot for Sam. I think he got a rough shake of things last year, and I think his offensive coordinator and head coach, both weren't doing him any favors at all or setting him up for success. So, part of me would also love to see Sam get another crack at it, but obviously just the way things are going and our draft positioning, I don't think that's going to happen. But Kingsbury, I like what he did with like you said, the Cardinals and Kyler Murray, and developing him into a rising star in this league. Yeah, he's had some hiccups and bumps along the way, but overall, I would not call that a failure by any means. This is also the guy that was responsible for Johnny Football. He was the head coach of A&M for 6-7 years, and was largely responsible, or offensive coordinator rather than head coach. I think he was actually, it's Texas Tech. He was the head coach of for a while, but he was the offensive coordinator during the time that Manziel kind of really hit the scene and came to light as well. So you could attribute some of Manziel's early success to Kliff Kingsbury. Now we all know that did, of course, not end as well as everyone wanted it to, but I do think there's a lot to be excited here, and I think regardless of if we do end up with a Caleb Williams or another rookie quarterback, or even in a scenario where we roll it back with Sam Howell again, I think that Kingsbury is a guy that is going to help all those guys, Sam Howell included, way more than a guy like Eric Bieniemy ever could.
All right, and that will do it for this emergency broadcast of the Going Commando podcast. I'd like to thank my co-host Chris and Clark for being able to record this today. Obviously, sort of caught us all off guard with the amount of news that came out in rapid succession, seemingly. And with that, we will conclude this broadcast of the Going Commando podcast. For my co-host Chris and Clark, and for myself, Tom, I'd like to thank you for listening. And remember, HTTR and HTTC.